TorahCafe.com.
As the economic squeeze gets harder and harder, and we move on to bankruptcy, as I understand it, there are situations when I'm bankrupt and I now have no legal duty to repay my creditors. Yes? Such a thing as
yes.
Comes out. If I then recover my wealth, 10 years later, do I have a moral duty as far as legal ethics is concerned to then attempt to repay them?
Jewish law, I think, says yes. That if I've gone bankrupt and I've recovered my money, although I bear no legal duty, I bear an ethical duty to repay the debt, at least when you're talking outside of a corporate structure where everybody understands the rules of the game. But when I borrow money from you, I go to my neighbor and I say, hey, my kid needs braces, but I really can't afford them. Can you lend me $1,000? I'll repay you in a month. And then I file for bankruptcy and I don't repay you and I get a discharge. The Jewish tradition says it's proper in that situation to repay the debt because neither of the parties really, in fact, operated with the understanding that, in fact, their bankruptcy was a possibility in that real world. That would be very different than if my corporation borrowed money from a bank. The bank has fully factored into the interest rate the possibility of bankruptcy. As a rule of thumb, I think the Jewish tradition says as follows. If I borrow an interest-free loan, which is an indication that the person who's lent it to me is doing an act of kindness. Somebody lends me money interest-free, they're engaging in an act of kindness. I bear a duty to repay that loan no matter what comes up in the future when I can. Of course, when I go to a bank and they charge me 19%, factoring all the risk in, and then I file for bankruptcy, the bank took the risk. They took the risk. They lost. That's life. I think that there's a difference between those two cases.
Yeah, because from my perspective, the motives that govern the act are morally significant, and that the bank, it's a straightforward business transaction, but if you're borrowing from your neighbor, it's an expression of friendship, and then friendship entails different obligations.
I don't think, by the way, it's from your friend. I think it's the absence of interest. When you go to your neighbor, and your neighbor says, I'm glad to lend you money, here's an IOU with an interest rate of 14%, it doesn't matter whether he's your neighbor or not. That's a business deal. That's a business deal. It's when I lend somebody money without interest, I am indicating that I wish to be charitable to you.
Okay. Do these obligations extend to other family members? I get this kind of question in the column all the time. It might be my parents had a debt and they're unable to pay it and they've died and I have no legal obligation to pay it, but do I have a moral obligation to? Or sometimes one spouse will pose that question to me. How does the law deal with that? And as I understand, no obligation in the situations I'm describing, but the Talmud has a different approach to this.
I think that there's a difference between a spouse and everybody else in Jewish law. Spouses frequently are represented to the world as partners. And that when one spouse borrows money, it's understood that there's a marital partnership here, and there might be, in many circumstances, an implied guarantee. I think that even though the parent-child relationship is just as loving, parents don't implicitly guarantee the loans of their children. I sure hope not. I sure hope not. Meaning, the nature of the parent-child relationship is a child might borrow a huge sum of money without consulting their parents because the child is 37 and the parents are 65. Spouses, I think, tend not to engage in that type of a conversation. And spouses are much more dependent. And when my neighbor knocks on my door and says, our child needs braces, can I borrow $1,000? And then that person dies, it's more intuitive to the Jewish tradition that the family unit, the spouse, is on the hook for that amount on an ethical level as well, whereas a child who doesn't live in the house, who's far away, who was completely uninvolved in this transaction, wouldn't even be morally on the hook.
I see.
But I just want to mention on a lighter note that there were several
several older gentlemen sitting around talking about the best way to leave a legacy for their children, to make sure their children would never forget them and always remember them. And one gentleman got up and said, when I die, I'm going to leave my kids $1 million in debt. And every time that telephone rings, they'll say, that father of mine, right?